Hello everyone, my name is Allie Miller and today I will be teaching you all about Punnett squares. Now, what is a Punnett square? A Punnett square is a diagram used to predict how likely an organism will have a particular genotype. Punnett squares are named after Reginald C. Punnett, who developed this method. They are commonly used by genetic counselors, physicians, nutritionists, and biologists, so if any of these are a career of interest for you, you would most likely be using Punnett squares quite often. Now, some terminology before we begin. It is important to know the difference between dominant traits and recessive traits. Dominant traits. These are inherited traits from one or more parents through a dominant allele. On a Punnett square, a dominant trait is capitalized. Recessive traits. These are inherited traits from both parents through a recessive allele. On a Punnett square, a recessive trait is lowercased. Now, homozygous. This means that you have two of the same alleles. They can be either homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. Heterozygous. This means that you have two different allele types. Now, let's make a Punnett square. Example 1. Let's say that you are trying to figure out whether a child would be born brunette or redhead. So it is less common that a child would be born with red hair. So let's make the recessive trait the redhead, being the lowercase h. And let's make the brunette the dominant trait, which is the capital H in this case. Now I'm going to give you a minute to try to fill out the chart and I'll show my answers to see if you got it correct, and then I will explain. Okay, here's what your chart should look like. So, in the first category, the two dominant traits should come together and form a homozygous dominant. Next, in the bottom left column, you should have the dominant and the recessive trait come together to form a heterozygous. This should also be what the top right column looks like. Next, in the bottom right-hand corner, it should be homozygous recessive traits, since both the lowercase h's come together. Now, I will show you how to read this data. So, since in the first column we only have dominant traits, it means that it must be a brunette trait. Now, here's where some people can get confused. When you have both a dominant and a recessive trait, in this case the capitalized H and the lowercase h, some people get confused as to how to determine which it will be. However, whenever you have a dominant trait, it will always be the dominant trait. So even though this child has an allele for both a brunette or a redhead, they would express the brunette allele. This would be the same for this column over here. Next, in the bottom right-hand corner, you have both recessive traits. So that means that they express the redhead allele since no brunette alleles are present. Now, by looking at this data, 75% would express the brunette alleles, whereas only 25% would express the redhead alleles, making this child more likely to be brunette by 75%. Let's move on to a different example. Example 2. What happens if both parents only express dominant traits? Notice how all the C's in this example are dominant. Let's say that the dominant trait in this case, you're trying to figure out the color of the cat's fur. So let's say the dominant trait is a brown-haired cat, and let's say that the recessive trait would be a gray-haired cat. So in this case, both of the cat's parents express the brown hair alleles. So again, I'm going to give you a few seconds to try to figure out what the chart would look like, and then I'll show you if you got the correct answer. Okay, here's what the chart should look like. Since only dominant traits are shown, that the whole entire chart would express dominant alleles across the board. So you should have the dominant homozygous traits for all categories, showing the capital C's. So this cat would have brown hair since both of the cat's parents also express the dominant trait for brown hair. This is one of the more easy examples compared to the last. Okay, let's move on to a final example of what you might see in your class. Example 3. Let's say that you're trying to determine whether or not a child will be born with widow's peak. Let's say that the capital W, dominant, will be widow's peak, since in real life cases, that would be what the dominant trait would be, whereas the lowercase w would be the recessive for not having widow's peak. Now, notice here how that's all lowercase w's. It will look very similar to the last example, except instead of all dominant traits, it would be all recessive traits. Now, I'm going to give you a few seconds to try to determine how this table would be. For a hint, look at the last table. It should be a very similar example. Okay, here's what your chart should look like. Again, it should have all recessive alleles. So in all columns, they should have the lowercase w. So this child would not be born with widow's peak since neither of the parents, which are shown up here and to the side, have the correct alleles for having widow's peak. Now you can make Punnett squares. Congratulations! I hope this video was helpful.